On his third night, as a janitor at Blackthorn Executive Airfield, Evan Rourke heard something that didn't belong. A broken vibration beneath the belly of the private jet scheduled to carry the CEO across the Atlantic before dawn. No one listened to a man holding a mop. He crouched beside the landing gear, laid his palm against the access panel, and identified a hairline fracture that would have cost everyone aboard everything at 38,000 feet. The flight was grounded, the accident was stopped, and Vivian Blackthorn stared at him the way people stare at a locked door that has just opened on its own. The following morning, she placed a contract in front of him worth $68,000 a month. If you believe that real ability cannot stay buried forever, stay with Evan Rourke and see what happens when the truth finally surfaces. 3 weeks before that night on the tarmac, Evan was sitting in a corridor on the 4th floor of Memorial West Hospital in Denver, listening to Dr. Claire Whitlock explain, in the careful language doctors use when the news is bad and the options are worse, that his 11-year-old daughter Sadie was eligible for a newly developed cardiac intervention that gave her the best statistical chance of a full recovery. The procedure was real, the specialist was ready, and the window of eligibility would not stay open indefinitely. What the insurance company had decided, after weeks of forms and appeals and letters written in the bloodless bureaucratic dialect that denied without feeling, was that the intervention was experimental in classification and therefore outside the scope of covered treatment. The deposit alone was a number that Evan had stopped writing down because writing it down made it more permanent than he could afford to think about. He had already sold the truck he used for weekend work, withdrawn everything from the account he had been building since Sadie was born, and taken on 3 separate contract jobs in the months following his wife's death, none of which had lasted long enough to matter. There was no engineering firm in Colorado, and very few in neighboring states, willing to look past the professional conduct notation attached to his licensing file, a notation placed there 6 years earlier after an incident that Evan had not caused but had been made to own. He was 38 years old, precise and calm in the way that people become when grief has removed every unnecessary thing from their personality, and he was prepared to do whatever the situation required. When a staffing agency listed an overnight maintenance position at Blackthorn Executive Airfield, he applied the same afternoon. The position paid modestly but offered full medical benefits and a shift differential that, combined with flexible daytime hours, meant he could be at the hospital when Sadie needed him and at the airfield when no one else would notice him. During the intake interview, he mentioned that he was comfortable working in technical environments and left it at that. The hiring coordinator gave him a uniform, a key card, and a rundown of the cleaning zones, and Evan thanked her and did not look at the executive jets parked beyond the security glass any longer than he had to. They had belonged to his world once, and now the world had rearranged itself, and he was going to clean the floors beneath them and be grateful for the paycheck. What he noticed on the drive home, reviewing the site layout in his memory the way his mind had always organized spatial information without being asked, was that one of the equipment crates staged near Hangar 4 bore a manufacturer's mark he recognized. A small hexagonal stamp that he had last seen on a parts manifest 6 years ago, in a folder that had disappeared from his possession along with everything else. Evan settled into the rhythm of the overnight shift within his first week, arriving early, finishing his assigned sections ahead of schedule, and moving through the maintenance hangars with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned, in another life, to treat every workspace as a system that could either support or betray the people depending on it. He did not chat with the other overnight staff, not because he was unfriendly, but because conversation invited questions, and questions invited the kind of story he was not ready to tell. What he could not stop himself from doing, because it was as involuntary as breathing, was observing. He watched the day-shift technicians run their pre-flight checks and noted the places where the checklist became a performance rather than a process. Boxes initialed without the corresponding step completed, inspection intervals marked as satisfied when the clock suggested otherwise. He saw maintenance logs with entries that had been copied word for word across multiple consecutive days, which was statistically unlikely for any fleet that was actually being flown. He spotted 3 replacement components staged for installation that carried part numbers he recognized as legitimate, but lacked the secondary traceability markings that indicated origin certification. He said nothing about any of this because his job was the floors, and he understood the political geography of hangars. A man with a mop who spoke about airframe components was not expressing concern. And overstepping got you removed before you could learn anything useful. Nolan Pierce, who ran the technical crew with the blunt authority of a man who had been doing the same job longer than most of his staff had been alive, made this clear directly on Evan's 4th night when he found him pausing too long near a Gulf Stream that had just cleared its evening inspection. Pierce said, without hostility but without warmth, that the safety line existed for a reason, and that maintenance staff would maintain, and cleaning staff would clean, and the arrangement had served everyone well enough. Evan nodded and stepped back and did not argue. A week later, he noticed a thin ribbon of hydraulic fluid spreading from beneath a light jet that had been signed off for a 6 a.m. departure, and he reported it to Pierce through the proper channel. A quiet word before the shift change, nothing dramatic. Pierce examined the area briefly, saw nothing conclusive in the artificial lighting, and told Evan the pre-flight would catch anything real. Evan folded a paper towel into a square and placed it flat beneath the point of concern before he left. When Pierce arrived the following morning, the paper was stained dark in a spreading oval, and the inspection that followed found a hydraulic seal that failed specification by a margin narrow enough that it would almost certainly have passed a ground check while producing a critical pressure drop under flight load. Pierce looked at Evan across the hangar floor and did not say anything, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Grant Holloway received a routine report later that day, noting that a new cleaning staff member had twice now redirected technician attention to maintenance concerns. And when he pulled the personnel file and saw the name Evan Rourke printed in the field labeled employee, the expression on his face was one that his assistant, had she been watching, would not have recognized. Vivian Blackthorne's relationship with Blackthorne Executive Airfield was not sentimental. She had inherited the original fixed base operation from her father at 31 and built it into a full-service aviation group with a fleet of 12 aircraft, 3 international maintenance contracts, and a reputation for the kind of discretion that high-net-worth clients paid for before they paid for anything else. At 41, she was the kind of executive that business journalists described as formidable when they meant to say intimidating, and she had long since stopped caring which word they used. What she was currently managing, behind the composure she maintained in every meeting and every corridor, was a coordinated erosion of confidence that was proving more difficult to counter than any single competitor had managed. A series of minor technical delays, nothing catastrophic, nothing even close to reportable under federal standards, had accumulated over 4 months into a pattern that the board was beginning to interpret as systemic mismanagement. 3 international clients had requested reviews of their service agreements. Damian Crown, whose Crown Meridian Aerospace had been circling Blackthorne Aviation for 2 years, had submitted a formal acquisition inquiry that Vivienne had declined without reading past the first paragraph, which was her right as majority shareholder, for now. She arrived at the airfield on a Tuesday to personally oversee the final preparations for a flight to London where she was to sign a partnership agreement with a European aviation consortium worth more to her long-term position than any single transaction in the company's history. She moved through the terminal with the focused stride of someone whose calendar was always an hour behind her intentions. And when a junior ground crew member stumbled backward from a service cart and sent a full coffee thermos, skidding toward the polished approach to the VIP gate, the spill was cleaned before her lead of 4 people reached the spot. She noticed the man with the cleaning cloth not because he was particularly visible, but because he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the jet on the other side of the glass with the precise, evaluating attention of someone who actually understood what he was seeing. She noted it and moved on. That evening, Evan found that his assignment quietly shifted from the hangar complex to the administrative wing, a change that had appeared in the scheduling system without explanation or memo. He understood what it meant, and he went where he was sent, because he was not yet in a position to do anything else. When he visited Sadie the following afternoon, and she asked whether his new job had anything to do with airplanes, he told her he mostly kept things clean and orderly, and that the airplanes were just part of the scenery. He did not mention that being near them every night was like standing at the edge of something he had built and then been locked out of. He did not mention that he had recognized, in the flight line crew's quiet deference to Grant Holloway during a routine walkthrough, the same careful body language that people used around men who had the power to end careers without raising their voices. Grant found Evan in the supply room on a Wednesday evening and introduced himself as the director of operations with the professional warmth of a man who has already decided the outcome of a conversation before it begins. He said, with a smile that did not change the quality of his eyes, that maintenance and cleaning each had its domain and that the company appreciated staff who understood their role. Evan looked at Grant Holloway, at the width of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the particular way his gaze moved sideways when it should have moved straight, and understood that this was not a man who had forgotten him. This was a man who had been hoping, for 6 years, that Evan would stay forgotten. The Blackthorn one was a long-range business jet configured for 8 passengers, maintained to a standard that reflected the fact that its most frequent traveler was the person whose name appeared on the tail. The flight to London had been scheduled for a Thursday evening departure, and because the London contract required Vivienne's physical signature before a competing consortium made its own approach to the same partners, the schedule had been treated as immovable. Grant had communicated to the lead technician that several of the repetitive systems confirmations, checks that were procedurally required, but that the experienced crew had performed so many times that they had become, in the operational culture of the hangar, a formality, could be abbreviated in the interest of keeping the timeline intact. Evan was working the far end of Hangar 1 when the hydraulic system was brought online for pre-flight verification, and he heard the sound immediately, a brief, stuttered vibration in the pressure cycle that lasted less than 2 seconds and recurred at irregular intervals too short to register on the automated monitoring display, but long enough, if you had spent 5 years studying the reliability signatures of fly-by-wire control systems, to tell you something was transferring load improperly. He reported it to Pierce, who had the aircraft's completed inspection sheets in hand and who ran a quick manual check that found nothing inconsistent with expected function. The boarding sequence began. The flight crew sealed the forward door. Evan was standing 60 feet away when he saw the thin dark line appear along the concrete beneath the port main gear assembly. Not a drip, a line, which meant flow, which meant pressure, which meant the hydraulic circuit was bleeding somewhere it was not supposed to bleed. He crossed the yellow safety line. He told the ground crew supervisor to stop the boarding. Grant was across the ramp in under a minute, flanked by 2 members of the security staff, his voice carrying the righteous volume of a man who understood that spectacle was a management tool. He told the assembled crew that Evan had a documented history of erratic professional conduct and was attempting to insert himself into a technical domain that he had no authority to touch, and he asked security to remove him from the airfield property. Vivienne walked through the boarding door. She looked at Evan and said he had 30 seconds to tell her something worth delaying a $9 billion contract negotiation. Evan told her the pressure cycle was stuttering between 32 and 38% efficiency at irregular intervals, which was consistent with a fractured internal line or a replacement valve that didn't meet the flow specification for this airframe. He told her the hydraulic fault would not trigger a ground warning because the delta was inside the sensor threshold, but that under sustained altitude load, the landing gear and secondary flight control systems would experience progressive pressure loss. He told her, without raising his voice or moving his hands, that if she wanted to verify the prediction without disassembling the entire system, she should ask her technician to check the valve cluster at the base of the port gear strut, because that was where the inconsistency in the vibration signature pointed. Vivienne looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at Evan. The access panel came off in 4 minutes. Inside was a hairline fracture along a hydraulic line union and, fitted where the original factory valve should have been, a replacement component bearing a serial number that did not match any approved substitution in the Blackthorn maintenance registry. If the jet had flown, the fault would have developed silently over the Atlantic, and the gear deployment on approach to London would have been the moment the system revealed how far it had already failed. Vivienne told the ground crew to secure the aircraft. She turned to Grant and said she would speak with him in the morning. She looked at Evan one more time before walking back toward the terminal, and whatever she was thinking, she kept it behind the same measured expression she had been wearing all evening. Inside her office, she picked up her phone and called Arden Sloan and said she needed a complete background trace on an overnight cleaning employee named Evan Rourke. Education, licensing history, professional conduct records, litigation, everything, and she needed it before the sun came up. Evan arrived at the executive level the following morning, expecting to collect his final paycheck and sign a separation form. He had run the calculation in the elevator, how many weeks he had gained, how much of the medical deposit the income had covered, whether he could find a second overnight position before the insurance gap created a problem. The office he was brought into was not a human resources room. Vivienne was seated behind a desk that held, in addition to the usual surfaces of executive authority, a printed copy of his engineering credential file, his doctoral thesis on hydraulic redundancy in asymmetric load conditions, the patent filing for a backup actuation mechanism currently installed in variants of 4 commercial aircraft types, and the incident report from the Halcyon Aeronautics Systems test that had ended his career. She said she knew who he was. She said she had known for about 6 hours. She asked him why, given everything in that file, he had applied for a cleaning position and spent 3 weeks mopping floors in a building full of aircraft he had once designed safety systems for. Evan said the position had health benefits and overnight shift differential, and that nothing else he had applied for would talk to him because of the professional conduct notation. He said he was not there to relitigate the past. He said his daughter's treatment schedule had a deposit deadline that he was working against, and that he needed the job to remain intact. Vivienne said the incident report from Halcyon showed that his formal objection to the hydraulic component sourcing had been removed from the final document. She said the version on file with the Aviation Authority contained a technician approval signature in a field that should have held his engineering supervisor's clearance, and that the field had been altered after the incident, not before. Evan said he was aware of what had been done, but that he had not been in a position to contest it effectively at the time his wife was in her final months, and that he had made a choice about where to put his remaining resources. He said he was not asking for anything and that she didn't owe him anything, and that he understood if the company needed to terminate his employment for crossing the safety line without authorization. Vivian said she was not going to fire him. She said she was going to offer him a 3-month contract at $68,000 per month to serve as the independent safety review lead for the Blackthorn fleet, reporting directly to her office, with the authority to ground any aircraft and the obligation to document every finding without revision. She said the figure was not charity. It reflected the liability exposure of a 12-aircraft charter and maintenance operation under active acquisition pressure and the value of having someone whose professional judgment had just prevented what would conservatively have been a catastrophic loss of confidence in the company at the worst possible moment. Evan said he wanted to know whether the contract was a way of keeping him occupied and attached to a non-disclosure clause, while the company managed the incident quietly. Vivian said she did not operate that way and that if she had wanted silence, she would have written him a check and escorted him to the parking lot. She said she was paying him because in a single night he had seen something that her entire technical infrastructure had missed, and she intended to understand why her infrastructure had missed it. Evan said he would accept 3 conditions. He said he needed unrestricted access to all maintenance records going back to the company's founding. He said no one was to revise or summarize any report he produced before it reached her desk. He said Nolan Pierce was to be assigned to the investigation, because Pierce was the first person on the technical side who had taken his concerns seriously, and Evan trusted the quality of his observations. Vivian agreed to all 3 without qualification. She signed the authorization document while he was still reading it. 20 minutes after Evan left the building, Grant Holloway made a call from his personal cell phone to a number stored under a business alias, and said to the man who answered that the engineer who was supposed to have stayed gone from aviation had just been handed keys to every locked cabinet in the building. The adjustment inside the airfield was not subtle. People who had once looked through Evan the way people look through furniture now handed him documents when he asked for them and answered his questions in the complete sentences that professional courtesy required. It did not make him comfortable, and he said so to no one, because the discomfort was not the point. He kept the folded cleaning uniform in the bottom drawer of his new desk, not as a trophy and not as a wound, but because it reminded him that the reason he had noticed the hydraulic fault was the same reason he had spent 3 weeks pushing a cart through the hangars. He had been close enough to the machinery to hear it thinking. He and Pierce began the systematic review with the component logs, pulling every replacement part installed across the fleet in the previous 14 months and cross-referencing each against the manufacturer's certification database, which was a slow and methodical process that Pierce undertook with the thoroughness of a man who had spent decades being personally offended by shortcuts. What they found was not dramatic in any individual instance. Replacement seals with valid-appearing paperwork but inconsistent material density. Sensor modules with legitimate case markings and counterfeit internal assemblies. Lubrication fittings from a supplier that existed in documentation but whose physical address corresponded to a commercial mail forwarding service in Nevada. Each anomaly was small enough to be dismissed as error or coincidence. Together, plotted against the flight schedule, they formed a shape that was unmistakable to Evan because he had studied system failure as a discipline for 15 years. The anomalies were not random. They were concentrated. Every component that fell outside specification had been installed in an aircraft that appeared on Vivian's personal flight itinerary within the previous 6 months. Someone was not causing maintenance failures to damage the fleet. Someone was causing maintenance failures to damage Vivian, or more precisely, to damage the board's confidence in her, at a rate carefully calibrated to look like accumulated negligence rather than deliberate sabotage. Arden traced the procurement chain backward from the flagged components and found a logistics intermediary that had been granted for preferred vendor status 8 months earlier, approved in a routine operational spending authorization signed by Grant. The intermediary's registered parent company was a shell incorporated in Delaware with one disclosed investor relationship that pointed, through 3 additional holding structures, to a fund that had publicly disclosed an ownership position in Crown Meridian Aerospace. Vivian sat with this information in the quiet of the observation deck above the main terminal, the city spread flat and lit below the mountain darkness, and said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, she said she had always understood that acquisition pressure was part of running an independent company in a consolidating industry, but that she had believed the rules of engagement, even among ruthless people, required a certain minimum of directness. Evan said some people preferred to win at a distance, where the damage looked like weather. She asked him why he had not fought the Halcyon incident through the legal system, because she had read enough of the original file to know he could have mounted a credible case. He said his wife had been diagnosed 3 months before the incident was closed, and that the legal process would have taken 2 to 3 years and every dollar he could raise, and that he had made a decision that he stood by even though it had cost him everything professional. He said he had believed, at the time, that the truth had a kind of structural permanence, that if the record was wrong, the wrongness would eventually become visible. He said he had been wrong about that. Vivian said she did not think he was weak for choosing his family. He said he didn't either, not anymore. Pierce called Evan the following morning from the parts storage facility with a flat, deliberate voice that Evan had learned meant Pierce was being careful with his words because the words mattered. He said he had found a hydraulic actuator in the sealed inspection inventory bearing a manufacturer's batch code that Pierce had seen once before, in a photograph attached to an NTSB preliminary findings memo, in an investigation into a test flight anomaly at a company called Halcyon Aeronautics. Evan took the actuator to his workbench and examined it for 40 minutes without speaking. The batch code was not a coincidence. Batch codes of that format encoded the manufacturing date, facility, and supplier contract, and this one matched the series that Evan had flagged in his internal report 6 years ago. The report that had been edited to remove his name from the findings and replace it with his signature on the approval line. The network that had supplied defective hydraulic components to Halcyon had not been shut down. It had migrated. It was now operating through the intermediary company Grant had approved inside Blackthorn Aviation. The architecture of what had been done to Evan's career and what was being done to Vivian's company were not parallel. They were continuous. The same procurement relationship, the same documentation method, the same technique of using just legal substitutions to create deniable failure modes. Grant had not simply buried Evan's findings at Halcyon. Grant had continued doing business with the same supplier network afterward, which meant Grant had understood what the network was and had found it useful. Arden ran a search for former Halcyon technical staff and found a name in an industry database that had been voluntarily removed from professional listings 2 years after the incident: Wesley Dane, who had been a senior systems technician at the time, and who was now, according to a sparse digital footprint, living in a small city in Central Oregon and not working in aviation. The contact information on file was 3 years old, but Arden found a current address through a property record. Wesley did not answer his phone. He responded to a written inquiry 2 days later with a message so brief that its brevity was itself a form of speech. He said he had left the industry because of what he had witnessed, that he had sent a formal objection to the revision of the incident report to his supervisor and received no response, and that he had no interest in being involved in anything that would make him visible again. The same afternoon, Sadie's care team called Evan to say that her most recent cardiac imaging showed the structural issue progressing more quickly than the previous model had predicted, and that the intervention timeline needed to move forward by at least 3 weeks. The first month's contract payment had already cleared, and Evan had applied it directly to the medical deposit, which meant the procedure was now scheduled. But the scheduling meant he was now operating with exactly the kind of divided attention that made errors. He arranged his workdays to allow him to be at the hospital during the 2 critical pre-procedure appointments and to carry his review work with him in the evenings. When Vivienne saw the schedule he was maintaining, she said the company's flight operations account included access to charter transport for executive-level staff, and that he was welcome to use it. He said he appreciated the offer and would use the bus, because the bus was what he had always used, and he didn't want to start thinking of himself as someone who took private transportation for personal appointments, because that kind of thinking changed the way a person evaluated things. She accepted this without argument, which was one of the things he was beginning to understand about her. She knew when something was a principle and not a negotiating position. Wesley sent a message to Nolan's encrypted work address, not Evan's, not Arden's, Nolan's, and said he had kept a personal copy of the original technical report from the Halcyon incident, that the copy included the revision history showing the pre-edit version of the document, and that someone who knew Evan was looking for him had reached out to a former colleague of Wesley's in the past 48 hours, which meant he was not going to wait around for whatever came next. Arden arranged the meeting at a diner 6 blocks from the airfield because neutral ground at a modest distance was preferable to anything that looked orchestrated. Wesley did not come. What arrived in his place, delivered via an encrypted transfer to Nolan's work account at the exact time the meeting was scheduled to begin, was a compressed archive containing 412 files, the original Halcyon technical report with full revision history, a chain of internal emails between Grant and the head of the parts procurement division, including explicit discussion of the cost-benefit of continuing with the uncertified supplier, and a payment ledger showing bonuses processed through a subsidiary account to 3 individuals who had signed off on the modified incident report. The 4th item in the archive, the one that took Evan longest to review, was a draft document dated 18 months in the past, outlining a phased plan to introduce controlled maintenance anomalies into a target aviation operator's fleet in coordination with a market position being built by a named acquiring party, and the target operator was identified by its FAA registry prefix, which corresponded to Blackthorn Aviation. The archive was protected by a password that Wesley had not included in his message. Grant moved first the following morning, appearing before the board's executive committee with a 14-page summary alleging that Evan's role as independent safety reviewer had been used to manufacture artificial groundings, that the $68,000 monthly figure represented a breach of fiduciary obligation, and that the entire arrangement should be investigated as a possible collusion between Vivienne and a former aviation employee with a documented conduct violation. The salary figure reached the financial press by afternoon, framed in the language of excess and absurdity. A janitor, earning nearly $1 million per year, hired by a CEO under unexplained circumstances, grounding aircraft and disrupting operations with no independent verification of his findings. Evan watched the coverage on a tablet in the hospital waiting room, while Sadie was in her pre-procedure evaluation and felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been publicly reduced before and knows exactly how long the process takes to run its course. He told Vivian, when she called, that he understood if she needed to distance the company from the arrangement, and that he would sign whatever was useful. She said that if she capitulated to a coordinated pressure campaign by firing the person whose work the campaign was designed to discredit, she would be demonstrating to everyone watching that she made decisions based on optics rather than substance, which would tell Damien Crone precisely what kind of opposition he was actually facing. She said she needed verifiable evidence before the full board convened in 72 hours. Evan sat with the encrypted archive on his screen and thought about what Wesley would have used as a password. Not a word, not a date as numerals, but a reference to something technical and specific, something only someone who had been inside the Halcyon incident would recognize. The test flight that had prompted the emergency landing had been designated by an internal project code, an alphanumeric sequence that had appeared in the internal report but not in any public filing. Evan typed it in. The archive opened. The day the board was scheduled to vote on the acquisition proposal was also the day Blackthorn Aviation was hosting a product demonstration for 12 invited guests, fleet managers, insurance underwriters, and aviation consultants representing 4 European operators who were evaluating the company's newest long-range platform for potential inclusion in their managed fleets. The demonstration was to culminate in a short flight with Vivian aboard, a visible gesture of confidence in both the aircraft and the company's technical standards. Grant had known the schedule for months, and Evan understood, working backward through the documents in the archive, that the demonstration flight had been the target date from the beginning. Not because a crash was the objective, but because a highly visible technical failure in front of an international audience, at precisely the moment the board was weighing an acquisition offer, would accomplish everything without requiring anything unrecoverable. The failure mode documented in the planning files was elegant in its narrowness. A data module inserted into the fuel management system designed to introduce a fractional reporting error that would pass every ground-level verification check and produce its effect only when the aircraft was operating under sustained load in adverse atmospheric conditions. The error would not cause an accident, it would cause an incident, a declared emergency, an early return, a visible loss of control over a company showcase, and the market response and board reaction would do the rest. Evan and Pierce swept the aircraft in the hours before the demonstration. Every documented system was nominal. Every verification matched its expected value. The fuel management display showed clean readings across all parameters. Evan walked the fuel system twice more, which was the kind of behavior Pierce had learned to interpret as Evan, hearing something that the instruments hadn't said yet, and on the third pass, Evan stopped at the management bay and looked at the wiring harness for longer than the wiring harness would ordinarily merit. The module was behind the primary sensor cluster, fixed with the same mounting brackets as the original equipment, indistinguishable in silhouette from the component it had been placed beside. Evan removed it with a panel tool borrowed from Pierce's kit and turned it over in his hand. Grant arrived in the hangar 18 seconds later with 2 security staff and the assertion, delivered in the voice of a man who had decided that offense was the only remaining posture, that Evan had just been observed tampering with aircraft systems in a deliberate act of sabotage. The security staff moved toward Evan. Vivian stepped out of the jetway at the far end of the hangar where she had been reviewing final documentation. She looked at the module in Evan's hand. She looked at Grant. The demonstration flight was canceled. The announcement was made publicly to the 12 guests assembled in the observation lounge in terms that were factual and brief. A precautionary technical review had identified an anomaly, and the flight would not proceed until the review was complete. Grant told the nearest board member, in the controlled aside of a man managing a collapse, that the vote on the acquisition could still proceed as scheduled that afternoon, and that the events of the morning had done nothing to change the underlying business case for accepting Crown Meridian's offer, and possibly had strengthened it. The board convened in the main conference room that adjoined the primary hangar, a space large enough to hold the 12 members plus counsel and, at Vivian's explicit authorization, Evan Rourke, who entered in the cleaning department uniform he had retrieved from the bottom drawer of his desk that morning. Several board members looked at the uniform the way people look at something that doesn't fit the context they've prepared for, which was precisely why he wore it. He did not open with his credentials. He did not contextualize his presence or apologize for the way he was dressed. He placed the removed fuel management module on the table and identified its serial number, its installation date as determined by the bracket wear pattern, and the procurement authorization under which it had been ordered. Grant Holloway's signature, applied to a purchase order routed through the same intermediary company that had supplied the defective hydraulic components. He then presented, section by section, the archive Wesley had sent. The original Halcyon incident report showing Evan's warning and the subsequent revision, the email chain documenting the decision to continue with the uncertified supplier, the planning document identifying Blackthorn Aviation as the target of the coordinated degradation campaign, and the financial records showing the compensation structure arranged for Grant upon successful completion of the acquisition. Nolan provided the independent technical verification, his own examination of each removed component, the laboratory analysis results for the hydraulic parts, and the chain of custody documentation for the fuel management module. Arden presented the corporate registry trace connecting the intermediary vendor to Crown Meridian's investment structure, the timeline of Grant's vendor approval decisions set against the acquisition approach timeline, and the communication records obtained through a lawful preservation request showing contact between Grant and a Crown Meridian executive in the week before each major fleet incident. Damian Crown sat at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who had anticipated several outcomes but not this particular sequence. He said the documents were fabricated. He said the chain of custody for the archive was unverifiable. He began to rise from his chair. Vivian said she appreciated his perspective and that she had taken the liberty of sharing it in advance with the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Investigations, whose representatives were currently in the building. Grant Holloway was escorted from the building by 2 federal aviation investigators and a representative from the district attorney's office before the board meeting formally adjourned. He said nothing publicly, and his attorney said nothing that was not a procedural formality. Damian Crown departed voluntarily, but into a situation that was no longer voluntary. The documents Arden had provided established enough of a predicate for a fraud investigation that the relevant agencies had already begun the process of securing records from Crown Meridian's acquisition division. There was no physical confrontation, no scene in the parking lot, no raised voices beyond the normal register of men who understand they are, in the presence of consequences they cannot argue away. The board voted to withdraw the acquisition proposal from consideration, unanimously and without extended deliberation, and passed a resolution confirming Vivian's full executive authority over the company's operations and strategic direction. In the weeks that followed, Blackthorn Aviation terminated its contracts with every vendor implicated in the parts substitution network and initiated a voluntary safety review with the aviation authority that exceeded the regulatory minimum in both scope and transparency. A fund was established to support employees facing medical hardship, seeded with a contribution from the company's discretionary reserves and administered by an independent trustee. The Aviation Authority's formal review of the Halcyon incident was reopened with the Wesley Archive as its primary evidentiary basis. The preliminary finding, issued 11 weeks after the board meeting, confirmed that the incident report had been materially altered after the fact, and that the original engineer of record had raised concerns that were properly documented and improperly removed. The professional conduct notation was withdrawn from Evan's licensing file. Vivian offered him the position of vice president for safety and system reliability, a role she said she had been meaning to create for 2 years but had never found the right person for. Partly because the right person, it turned out, had been working nights in her hangars. Evan said he would accept if the compensation package included a provision allowing him to direct a portion of his annual bonus to the Employee Hardship Fund rather than receiving it personally, which Vivian agreed to without requiring him to explain further. Sadie completed her cardiac procedure 6 weeks after the contract dispute had resolved, and the result was what the specialist had projected: clean, successful, with a recovery timeline that her doctors described with the careful optimism of people who have learned not to overpromise, but who, in this case, had genuinely good news to deliver. Evan sat beside her bed in the afternoon after the procedure, in the particular quiet of hospital rooms when the hard thing has happened and turned out not to be the worst thing. And he read her the official letter confirming his professional reinstatement. She asked what it meant. He said it meant that the people who had said he had done something wrong had been found to have been wrong themselves. She said that seemed like a long time for that to take. He said yes. He said some things took the time they took. He did not cry about the reinstatement. He was not built for that kind of release. What moved him, in the way that only the things that have cost the most can move a person, was that for the first time in 6 years he was going to be able to answer honestly when Sadie asked him what he did for work. 1 year after the night, Evan Rourke crossed a yellow safety line with a mop cart still in his hand. Blackthorn Executive Airfield published a safety audit result that placed it among the top 3 private aviation facilities in the country by independent measure. The facility had been graded not only on technical compliance, but on the transparency of its documentation, the robustness of its reporting structures, and the degree to which its safety culture was verifiable rather than merely claimed. Criteria that Evan had written into the audit framework himself. His old cleaning uniform was framed and mounted on the wall of his office, which was a corner office on the executive level with a window that faced the flight line. The small card beneath it read, "The work does not determine the worth of the person doing it." Sadie was back at school, back at the science fair she had been too tired to enter the previous year, back to the ordinary invincibility of a child who has come through something and not been diminished by it. She came to the airfield once, on the day the Employee Hardship Fund held its first formal distribution event, and she walked the hangar floor with the deliberate curiosity of someone who intended to understand whatever she was looking at. Vivian found Evan on the observation deck in the early evening of the fund's anniversary, both of them watching a long-range jet climb out on its departure heading, the running lights diminishing into the darkening range of the Rockies. She said that a year ago he had stood in her office in a cleaning uniform expecting her to fire him. He said he remembered that he had been doing the arithmetic on bus fares in the elevator on the way up, because he had not wanted to hope for a different outcome and had thought it was better to know exactly what he was returning to. She said she owed him a dinner that had nothing to do with the company's business, which was something she had been meaning to say for several months, and had kept finding reasons to defer. He said he would consider that fair compensation for the overtime. She said she thought he would probably have survived without her. He said he thought so too, but that surviving was not the same as the thing that had actually happened, which was that he had found his way back not just to the work, but to the belief that the work was worth doing. The jet they had been watching slipped past the last visible reach of its lights and disappeared into the cloud layer above the peaks, moving cleanly through the dark on systems that would hold, toward a destination that the people aboard could trust. Evan turned from the window and walked back toward the terminal, neither a janitor nor a hero, but a man who had finally gotten to the other side of the years that had been taken from him, carrying nothing that wasn't his.